Hello, AP Environmental Science. This unit is about land, public and private, the land use concepts and how we classify them, and land management practices. In land use concepts and classifications, humans value land for what it can provide, like food, shelter, and resources, maybe just its overall intrinsic beauty. However, human use of the land for these purposes can create problems, some of which can be prevented, and we need to address those regulations. In land management practices, whether resources are conserved or overexploited just depends on the number of factors that are related to like economics, human behavior, and specific management practices. So proper resource management also depends on specific aspects of the type of land that's involved, as well as the agencies and guidelines. Land use concepts and classification. By the end of this video, please be able to explain how human land use affects the environment and describe the various categories of public land used globally and in the United States. Agriculture, housing, recreation, industry, mining, and waste disposal are all land uses that benefit humans. But we have seen in previous units here that these activities also have negative consequences. Extensive logging may lead to mudslides and deforestation of large areas that contributes to, climate change and many other environmental problems. Change to the landscape is the single largest cause of species extinction today. Paving over land surfaces, reroutes water, increases runoff, and those paved surfaces also absorb heat from the sun and redirect it, creating urban, what we call heat islands. Overuse of farmlands can lead to soil degradation and, of course, water pollution. Every human uses land and alters it in some way. Furthermore, individual activities on any parcel of land can have a wide range of effects on other land. For the reason, communities around the world use a number of methods, including laws, to influence or regulate both private and public land use. As we've seen at the beginning with Julia Butterfly Hill, people do not always agree on land use and its management practices. Do we save a beautiful ancient stand of trees, or do we harvest the trees in order to gain benefits from them like jobs, profits, building materials, economic development? Such conflicts can arise on both public and private land. So to understand land use and the management issues that are, involved in that, environmental scientists use three concepts: tragedy of the commons, externalities, and maximum sustainable yield. Let's start with the tragedy of the commons. Perhaps you've heard of this before. In certain societies, land is viewed as a common resource. Anyone could use land for foraging, growing crops, or cutting down trees, hunting, or mining. But as populations increase, such common lands tend to become degraded. They can become overgrazed, overharvested, and deforested. In 1968, ecologist Garrett Hardin brought some of these issues of overuse of common resources to the attention of broader scientific community when he described it as the tragedy of the commons, the tendency of shared property and other limited resources to become depleted because people act from self-interest and from their short-term gain. Hardin observed that when many individuals share a common resource without an agreement or without a regulation of how it's going to be used, it is likely to become overused very quickly. For example, imagine a commercial pasture on which many farmers graze their sheep, like the one shown here in this figure. At first, no single farmer appears to have too many sheep, but because an individual farmer gains from raising sheep and selling them, each farmer may have been tempted to add sheep to that pasture. However, the total number of sheep owned by all the farmers continues to grow. The number of sheep will soon exceed the carrying capacity of the land. The sheep will overgraze the common pasture to the point of which the plants will no longer have a chance to recover, and so the common land will be degraded, and the sheep will no longer have an adequate nutritional source. So over a long period, the entire community will eventually suffer. And when the farmers make decisions like this that benefit only their own short-term gain and do not consider the overall common goal, everyone loses. So the tragedy of the commons applies to not only agriculture, but to any public available resource that is used by everyone who lives there. If it's not regulated, including land, air, or water, it has the tendency to be overexploited. So, for example, the use of global fisheries is a common exploitation. The rapid decline of commercial fishing and harvesting of species has a global effect, and it can upset not only just one system where people are fishing offshore, but an entire marine ecosystem. If the use of common land is not regulated in some way, by the users or by the government, the land can easily be degraded, and to the point of which it's no longer useful. We have a lot of examples in our human history about the tragedy of the commons. Unfortunately, it's commonplace as humans work on their own self-interest instead of thinking of the community as a whole, to the point where we can actually talk to children about it. And perhaps you've learned about tragedy of the commons for many years, and you can think of a lot more examples than just a cow pasture. Externalities. The tragedy of the commons is a result of an economic phenomenon called negative externality. More general, an externality is the cost or benefit of a good or service that is not included in the purchase price of that good or service. So, for example, if a bakery moves into a building next to you and you wake up every morning to that delicious smell of freshly baked bread, you are benefiting from a positive externality. On the other hand, if the bakers arrive at 3 in the morning and make so much noise that they interrupt your sleep, you make less productive days in your job, then you are suffering from what's called a negative externality. In environmental science, we are especially concerned with negative externality because they so often lead to serious environmental damage, and with that damage, no one is held legally or financially responsible. For example, if one farmer grazes too many sheep in the common pasture, his actions will ultimately result in total harm and total loss and benefit for him. But as long as the land continues to support grazing, the individual farmer will not have to pay for the harm that he is causing. Ultimately, this cost is externalized to one of the other farmers. If the farmer is responsible for that extra sheep had to bear the cost of his overuse of the land, he would not graze the extra sheep in that common area. The cost of doing so would exceed his benefit. So from this example, we can see that in order to calculate the true cost of using a resource, we must always use the externalized cost. In other words, we must make account for any potential harm that comes to others from the overuse of a resource. So economists say that private ownership can prevent the tragedy of the commons situation. I mean, after all, a landowner is much less likely to overgraze and overuse his own land than he would if it were common land. So regulations is another approach. If a local government could prevent overuse of common pasture by passing an ordinance that permits only a certain number of sheep to graze there, then we can prevent the tragedy of the commons. Challenging the idea that a government regulation is necessary is this professor from Indiana University, Eleanor Ostrom. This professor said that the property can be used and used effectively, more manageably by the actual common people than it can by institutions. And she did a big research project on it. And she actually won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009. And basically, her research showed that that self-regulation of these resources and its users in the common area can prevent tragedy of the commons. and that government regulations and government intervention is unnecessary when it comes to shared property. Maximum sustainable yield. Essentially, we want to obtain the maximum amount of resources that we need. Then, if we need to do that, then we need to know how much a given plant or animal population can be harvested without harming other resources. So imagine a situation where which deer hunting in a public forest is unregulated, with each hunter free to kind of harvest as many deer as possible. As a result of unlimited hunting, the deer population could be depleted to the point of where it's endangered. This, in turn, would disrupt the functioning of the forest ecosystem. Alright, on the other hand, if hunting were completely prohibited, the herd of deer living in that area might grow so large and numerous that there's not enough food in the forest or in the fields to support that herd. In turn, this has happened before. The deer starve to death, they get sick. In extreme cases, like the ones of St. Paul Island, the population can grow unchecked until it nearly crashes and starves to death. So some intermediate amount of hunting will leave enough adult deer to reproduce at a rate that will maintain a population, but not leave so many that there's too much competition for food. This intermediate harvest is what we call the maximum sustainable yield. Specifically, maximum sustainable yield of a renewable resource is the maximum amount that can be harvested without compromising the future availability of this resource. In other words, it's the maximum harvest that we can adequately replace with the population. MSY varies case by case, of course, and depends on the species. A reasonable starting point is to assume that a population growth in a forest at about 1/2 of its carrying capacity is going to produce an S-shaped curve. Hence the reasons wildlife management, biologists, ecologists try to do mark and recaptures, population estimates to find out exactly where is this carrying capacity. Because if we're talking about deer, a resource that a lot of people rely on, knowing where that number is how we regulate, sell hunting licenses, sell deer tags. It becomes an important part of managing our wildlife areas. Forest trees, like animal populations, have a maximum sustainable yield. Loggers may be removing a particular percentage of trees at a site in order to allow a certain amount of light to penetrate the forest floor and reach the younger trees, and of course they grow faster. Alright, however, if you cut too many trees, then the excess sunlight will penetrate and dry the forest soil. This drying may create conditions that are inhospitable to trees germinating on the ground, thus inhibiting adequate reforestation and regrowth of the forest. So in theory, harvesting the maximum sustainable yield should permit this constant, indefinite regrowth without the depletion of any other resource. And in reality, though, it is very difficult to calculate this MSY with certainty because we're talking natural ecosystems, and it is difficult to obtain necessary information such as birth rates, death rates, and carrying capacity of an entire ecosystem and all the species within it. So once MSY calculations can be made, we cannot know if the yield is truly sustainable or not until months or years later. Even when we've evaluated the effects of this harvesting process in that time, it may be too late. So if the harvest rate has been too great, then it's too late to prevent harm to that population.